And thanks very much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. And apologies also to the organizers of this conference, because they gave me a title and I took the liberty to change it slightly. As you can see on the slide, I added the notion of not only in times of crisis. And the reason why I did this is that basically my work on how to help disadvantaged people takes a more longer-term perspective. I've been studying the issue over the years and looked more at the past, I would say, the pre-crisis years, but also because maybe the crisis made us realize many things. Maybe one of those things that made us scientists, academics, realize is how slow we are before we can say interesting things about social and economic developments. I remember 2008, 2009, when this kind of earthquake, economic earthquake, happened. That we were asked by politicians, what do you have to say to us, basically? And we were really in trouble finding interesting things, even finding the right question. Now we are just beginning, I think, and the presentation by Stefano Scarpetta was a brilliant example of how we are beginning now to be able to say interesting things. But we need hindsight, I think. Academia, science needs hindsight to really come up with solid knowledge. And that's one reason why I decided to focus not only in times of crisis, and they take a longer-term perspective, but of course I would try, when possible, to make the connection with what has been happening over the last 3-4 years, mostly in Europe, because that's my area, geographic area of interest. Of course, the crisis is a much broader event and development. So, social policies for the disadvantaged, not only in times of crisis, is the actual title of the presentation. I would like to start by talking about who are the disadvantaged. Of course, there are many categories of people who experience disadvantage, particularly now in this time of crisis. But in this longer-term perspective, I think it makes sense to focus on a group defined by educational achievement, and particularly on the low-skilled. If you look at indicators of disadvantage, it could be unemployment, it could be lack of employment more generally, it could be poverty. You always find more or less systematically that low-skill status is strongly associated with disadvantage across countries. And we may discuss whether this has always been like that. Presumably to an extent, yes. Being less skilled has always, almost by definition, represented a disadvantage. But there are various reasons to believe that the penalty experienced by low-skilled people over the years has increased and is particularly stronger today in these post-industrial societies, post-industrial economies, where most of the employment takes place in the services. Industry, manufacturing industry of the type we had in the 50s, in the 60s, was a boon for low-skilled people, because they could access employment in these manufacturing industries and obtain decent and rising wages, wages which rose in line with productivity increases. It could be quite strong because of technological advances. Now this is over, this phenomenon. Low-skilled people, these jobs, if they exist, they are in China, in India, in other emerging countries, or they've been replaced by machines. And the kind of jobs that today low-skilled people can access, essentially in Europe, they are low-skilled service jobs, which tend to be of lower quality, and in small numbers as well. This development is largely independent of the economic cycle. Of course, there is an economic cycle that affects low-skilled people, but the increased penalty, it's not something that seems to go away when the economy is booming. If you look at the situation of the low-skilled people in, say, 2006, 7, 8, when European economies, job markets were doing well, you still find a big disadvantage according to most indicators, social indicators. So I want to talk about this particular group of people, which is very important from a social policy perspective, as we are going to see. And why are they experiencing an increased penalty, an increased disadvantage? And there is a big literature on this, and this is probably nothing new for many of you. But I think it's important to sort of remind people of the key mechanisms that are behind this notion of an increased penalty for low-skilled people. One theory, one explanation is the one you find on this slide: skill-biased technological change. The idea that technological change in our economies, in advanced economies, has meant that we need more and more skilled people, more or less, and fewer low-skilled people. And this creates imbalances in the labor market. And one imbalance is that we are experiencing, I think, throughout Europe, an oversupply of low-skilled people. There are more low-skilled people that are looking for jobs than there are jobs available for them. And this is not a new idea. It's an idea that has been around since at least the 80s. That of skill-biased technological change, which has been discussed, which has been questioned. But my impression is that the fundamental element of this theory are still really convincing as an explanation of what is going on. Then the question is whether this explains, for example, the rise in inequality, or is it more politics which explains the rise in inequality. But the fact that there is skill-biased technological change, I don't think it is really something which is being questioned, except in a few studies. For example, there are studies now that talk about polarization instead of an upper shift in skills. So apparently in some countries, at least, the labor markets are not just going upwards in terms of the skills they require, they're polarizing. You have increasing demand of labor for high-skilled jobs, but you also have increasing demand of labor for low-skilled jobs. And this may sound like good news for disadvantaged low-skilled people, more jobs for them. But in reality, when you see this type of polarization turns out to be a mixed blessing for low-skilled people. Why? Because if you have polarization, you tend to have destruction or job losses in the middle of the skill distribution, and you have people with a mid-skill level who compete downwards. They cannot go upwards, and so they're going to compete downwards. The phenomenon is called displacement. And there is research that shows, in Germany, for example, that you have this kind of displacement. You have people with an average level of qualification who are competing with low-skilled people and pushing them out downwards in the labor market. So these variations, if you wish, on the skill-biased technological change thesis, I think they're important to consider, but they don't really invalidate the overall assessment that we can make of the situation, that the structural functioning of today's post-industrial economy is really producing disadvantaged people in the low-skill segment of the labor market. This you can see in various indicators. This is an indicator, it's the employment rate by educational attainment, and that's a picture taken just before the crisis. And I mean, as you can see, in all countries, low-skilled people, it's the blue column, have employment rates that are way below those of their more skilled peers. It's also interesting to notice, I mean, this is 2008 is the moment of maximum expansion of employment in all these countries, perhaps except the US, which is already beginning to experience the crisis. But you see that the disadvantage is still very important. So this goes towards what I was saying at the beginning, that even at times of good economic performance, the penalty experienced by low-skilled people doesn't seem to go away. And then the second interesting thing you see on this graph is the fact that country differences in employment performance are to a large extent due to differences in the low-skilled segment of the labor market. If you look at the green columns, people with a university degree, you see that the employment rates are not so different across countries. If you are a Danish graduate or an Italian graduate, the probability of being in employment in 2008 was about the same, not exactly the same, but about the same. But if you are a low-skilled people, then the difference is much bigger among these countries. So this suggests that the mechanics of job creation may be playing a role in explaining these cross-national differences. And there is literature which already, it's not particularly new, but I think it's important sort of to remind people of these findings, of this knowledge, because that's what I'm going to build upon later on. There is literature that has studied the mechanisms of job creation in the low-skilled segment of the labor market. People like Josta Esping Andersen, Torben Iversen, and Anne Wren, which are quoted on this slide. And basically what they have argued, that there is a trade-off between quantity and quality of low-skilled jobs. You can either have many low-skilled jobs, but these will tend to be of low quality, low-paid, especially low-paid relative to middle-income people, or you can have better quality jobs, but you're going to have fewer of those jobs. And the rationale behind this reasoning, which is a reasoning which has been put forward by these authors some 10, 15 years ago, the rationale is that these low-skilled services we're talking about are services which basically provide family services, things like food preparation, cleaning services, laundry services, all these kind of services which families can decide whether they're going to buy on the market or they're going to produce themselves. And if they are too costly, if the wage differential between the buyers and the producers of those services is too close, then it's not worthwhile. If the person who irons shirts in a laundry earns as much as I do, I'm not going to take my shirt there to be ironed. I'm going to do it myself, of course. So what they say, these people told us in the late 90s, is that you need a certain level of inequality, wage inequality, basically, unless you have corrections. Of course, you can always have a policy-based correction, but unless you have corrections, you need a certain level of inequality to see good job creation in this segment of the labor market. And there are some variations also on this thesis which have come later on. For example, an addition made by an American colleague, Tom DePreet, who argued that in Europe inequality concerns more job security than earnings, and there is probably a functional equivalent mechanism going on in this respect. So this is a thesis that has been around for a while. It has been questioned also, but I'm pretty convinced that it helps us understand what goes on. Some have argued that it is economic growth in reality that matters more than inequality. The data that we can look at now is mixed, but I don't think goes in the direction that inequality doesn't matter and growth matters. We can look at some data too. Here, what I did, I simply looked at the performance in terms of low-skill employment creation during the expansion period, late 90s, late 2000, but before the crisis. And what you see here is that you have countries which have really profited of this expansion period to expand low-skill employment, and they are to the left on the graph, Spain, Germany, New Zealand, Denmark, Australia. Then you have other countries which have not really taken advantage, apparently, of this expansion. And maybe just a first element that you need in order to interpret correctly this graph is that the countries which are on the right-hand side, those who have seen a small reduction, are not really bad performing countries. They're just countries who had a very high level of low-skill employment at the beginning of the period. And so this is a percentage you cannot go higher than 100. And so, of course, if you're already high, it's obvious that you want to go higher, even if you're doing everything right in terms of policy. So it's more interesting to look at the countries on the left-hand side, those who at the beginning of the period had a relatively low employment rate for low-skilled people, and at the end they had a high employment rate. But if you take, for example, the four first countries here, Spain, Germany, New Zealand, Denmark, I mean, anyone who knows a thing or two about labor market policy, social policy, knows that there is nothing in common between these four countries, Spain, Germany, New Zealand, and Denmark. In any attempt to classify countries, they end up in different clusters. So it's pretty difficult on this basis to come up with a theory or an explanation as to what makes a country more successful in creating low-skill employment. And maybe you can come up with a country-based explanation. For Spain, probably it was the economic boom, the growth, the bubble, and so on. For Germany, it may have been the arts reform, the reform of the benefit system, and the labor market deregulation. New Zealand has seen a big expansion in inequality over the same period of time. Denmark, maybe it's the activation story that we find convincing, but we're not going very far if we have to come up with a different explanation for each country. In respect to what really allowed those countries to increase their rate of low-skill employment. If we try to look at the bivariate correlations, growth, for example, you see growth doesn't seem to have played any significant role in this period in accounting for the expansion of employment. Here you see on the horizontal axis is the average growth rate over the period covered by the analysis, 97-2009, and on the left, on the y-axis you have the figures you saw in the previous graph. So the increase or the reduction in the rate of employment of people, low-skilled people, and you see that there is really no discernible impact of growth on this. Not saying that growth doesn't matter. These are pretty weak instruments to get this bivariate correlation, or very strong instrument to get at real mechanisms, but there is obviously something else going on other than growth. And you can test the inequality hypothesis, and here you find a slightly stronger correlation between inequality, increase in inequality, and increase in low-skill employment. The correlation is not very strong, it's not significant, the one you see on these slides. But if you control for the starting point, you remember what I said earlier, that countries which saw a decline in low-skill employment were countries where low-skill employment was already very high at the beginning. So if you control for this, basically what happens, the control pushes up these countries about here in the graph, and then you have a significant correlation between the two. And I've spent a large part of this summer sort of playing with this data, as some people would say, torturing this data to try to find a nice correlation, something that really explains this variation in labor market performance, in job creation for low-skilled people, and I couldn't really. There is nothing, at least with the data that is easily available, that really allows us to explain in a general way the expansion of employment. But I think the evidence goes really not against, certainly, the common knowledge in this respect, the knowledge that it is really a question of inequality, of deregulation of the labor market that allows job creation in this segment of the labor market. So the equality, the job quality and quantity trade-off that I mentioned earlier seems to me to remain a convincing explanation of cross-national variations in this respect, or the most convincing explanation given the absence of a better one. Some of the consequences of these developments is that low-skilled people are overrepresented among what I call here last resort benefit recipients. These last resort benefits are benefit schemes that exist in every country, not in every country, in most European countries. They are social assistance. They're called social assistance. In some cases, they have different names in different countries. And this is national data, so it's not comparable. You cannot really compare the figures for, say, Germany with those of France, but every country provides data concerning the skill level of the beneficiaries relative to the skill level of the general population. And you see here that in every of these countries, every one of these countries, low-skilled people are vastly overrepresented among last resort benefit schemes. And I would add to this that these are probably underestimates, in the sense that in those who are not low-skilled, who are on, say, Artsphere in Germany or on RSA in France, among those who are not low-skilled, formerly not low-skilled, probably there are many who are de facto low-skilled, in the sense that maybe they earned a degree 20, 30 years ago, which is worth nothing today in the labor market because it's obsolete. So these are underestimates really of the impact of marketable skills on the likelihood of ending up in a scheme. So this is one of the consequences, or one of the correlates of the disadvantage faced in the labor market by low-skilled people. And now that I've sort of painted the picture of this group of people and how they're faring in today's post-industrial labor market, I would like to turn to the solutions that have been put in place by European countries over the last 20 years or so. And the main tool, not the only one, but I would argue the main tool, and the one I'm going to focus on, is active labor market policy. And I'm well aware that it is not the only one, but one needs to focus analysis if one wants to move forward. And active labor market policy is one of those very broad concepts that can mean many different things to different people. And so in order to sort of minimize the risk of confusion, I've tried to break it down into categories or types of interventions that are usually considered as being part of active labor market policy. This is something I've taken from another publication I published in 2010 in a journal called Politics and Society. And basically I identify two dimensions: investment in human capital, the extent to which the policy invests in human capital, and the pro-market employment orientation of the measured intervention, the extent to which people are expected to actually enter the market employment. And by intersecting these two dimensions, I end up with 4 different types of active labor market policy: upskilling, which is basically related to vocational training; improve matching, how policies can improve the encounter between job seekers and companies in the labor market. Putting pressure is also something which is obviously very important today in many activation strategies, putting pressure on people so that they accept jobs that they would not otherwise have accepted in the absence of this pressure. Difficult to measure, this I will say something later on. And then preservation of human capital. Here I'm thinking more of a subsidized job, time-limited subsidized jobs in the public sector, which have been around for a long while in Europe, which had a pretty bad press in the evaluation literature for a long while. And this, I'm not going to do much with this classification today. It's just a tool to sort of divide up the field of active labor market policy in a way that is, I hope, comprehensible and maybe clearer than simply talk about activation or active labor market policy or welfare to work, which are all notions that are very, very vague. And so what I did over summer, in the time I was not torturing the data, I spent the other time reading evaluation studies of different types of active labor market policy to try to find out to what extent these policies can be helpful in relieving the plight, in improving the situation of low-skilled people. And they started with upskilling, with training. And there is a huge amount of literature, evaluation literature of training programs that are related to unemployment policy. And you also find many meta-analysis, which are analysis of evaluations, which are attempts to synthesize, sometimes with statistical methods, hundreds of evaluations. So we really have, I think, a lot of knowledge that is out there. The challenge is how to sort of bring it together and make sense. This is what do, for example, some of these colleagues who have done this meta-analysis to try to... And one of these meta-analyses, for example, has been made by an American economist, Jim Heckman, who is also a Nobel Prize winner. And basically he argues that training has mostly no or weak result. I'm talking about labor market policy-related training only, not training in general, of course. Training that is available to jobless people in the context of labor market policy finds mostly no or weak results for a reason that he has spent a lot of time exploring. Basically, he argues that in order to succeed in training, you need some basic level of skills, cognitive skills, reading, calculation, for example, math, but also non-cognitive skills, things like patience, perseverance, for example, that many people who end up on unemployment, on social benefit schemes, just don't have. And then it's very difficult for them to profit from training. So this is his argument as to why, one of these arguments to why training is not effective. The other one is that training in the US has tended to be very low quality training, like at least the ones that have been studied by Heckman, things like, I don't know, a couple of months training for a new profession, but not something like we have in some European countries, Germany, for example, an apprenticeship, a full vocational training. If you look at European studies, maybe there is some more grounds for optimism. I mentioned 2 studies, European studies. One is an Austrian study where, following from the privatization of the metal industry, the steel industry in Austria, there was a foundation which was set up with the parts of the proceeding of the privatization, which would provide the retraining to all the workers who had been dismissed as a result of this privatization process. And there has been an evaluation of and this was full vocational training, so people would receive a proper, complete new vocational training lasting 2 or 3 years, something like this. Good quality training. And the evaluation finds a 5 to 7% increase between a control group and the participant in earnings. And there is a German study, which is a broader one. Germany also provides this kind of good quality conversion training where people who are unemployed can really learn a new profession. They spend 2 years intensive training on the job and so on, good quality training. And this has been evaluated by a Swiss colleague, Michael Lechner. And he finds 10 to 15 percentage points increases in the employment rate in the treatment or the program group relative to a control group. And I have to say that these figures, they may not sound very spectacular. 5 to 7%, 10 to 15% doesn't sound spectacular. Of course, you need to add this to, for the employment rate, for example, you need to add this to 30%, 40%, 50% of people who would have found a job anyway. But still, it's not spectacular, I think. It's not very glorious as a result. It might be worthwhile doing it because people who don't find a job remain on social benefits and can cost a lot of money over a fair period of time. But it's true that it is not spectacular. I will come back to this, the size, how to interpret, how to evaluate the size of this effect later on. But now I wanted to stay a little bit on the issue of training and what comes out from both these studies, which really confirms also the view that Jim Heckman, the American economist, Nobel Prize winner, has put forward, is that not anyone can profit from training. The story I told you about this Austrian foundation providing retraining to workers dismissed in the metal industry. What is most striking, I think, in reading this is that only 12% of those who were eligible for the training program actually decided to take part. Most of the workers who were eligible for this good quality training program did not take part. And if you look at who took part, they were more likely to be Austrian relative to immigrants. They were more likely to have already a certain amount of skills of education relative to those who did not take part. And here I talk about a double Matthew effect. Those of you who are not social policy specialists maybe don't know what Matthew effect is. It comes from the Bible, don't know exactly, but we refer to Matthew effect when in a social policy it's not the most disadvantaged who benefit most, but it's people who are already or relatively advantaged who benefit most from the policy. And they talk about a double Matthew effect. One is the selection, in the selection, so people self-select themselves into training are people who have better qualities, better chances to make it anyway. And then the second one is that there is other research, I'm thinking of a Swedish study, that shows that people who enter, even though they have low-skilled, really low-skilled, just compulsory education and do enter training, are less likely to benefit afterwards. So truly disadvantaged people are less likely to enter training, and if they do enter, they're less likely to benefit from it. So that's why I'm talking of a double Matthew effect, which is, I think, rather worrying. And in a way, Heckman, the American economist, is very pessimistic in his analysis of what training can do of good in labor market policy. Basically, he says that we should invest in children rather than in unemployed people. But I think this is too quick a conclusion, even though probably his analysis is sound, but it's too quick a conclusion. And for me, the challenge is how to make training more accessible and how to sort of create, first, better understand the conditions that make training work and how to create them once we have understood them. We need more research in this respect, I think. I would like now to move on to the second of the four labor market policy, active labor market policy type that I have mentioned in the previous slide, improving labor market matching. So here I'm thinking of the marital agency or the dating agency function of employment policy. You have employers looking for employees and you have job seekers looking for jobs. How to make sure that the right matches occur in the labor market. And as we all know, the labor market is an imperfect market, and so it's not so easy to make sure that these job matches really occur, good job matches occur. And if we stay focused on the low-skilled segment of the labor market, I think we are forced to accept that this the people who are low skill and were looking for jobs, face two big additional problems or bigger problems than people in other segments of the labor market, which are mentioned on this slide. The first one is that the low skill segment is particularly intransparent. I'm going to explain in a moment what I mean by it. And the second idea is that low skill status, the fact of not having completed, say, a vocational education or having low skilled, correlates with, and these correlates are often used as negative signals by recruiters. You know, there is a big literature, and I think we understand pretty well how the recruitment process works in companies. Employers have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, and they're going to use signals to decide who is likely to be a good worker and who is less likely to be a bad worker. And typical signals include age, for example, include ethnic origin, for example, but also the fact of being low skilled, apparently, even for low skilled jobs, is being used as a negative signal, which may sound a bit absurd, but there is research showing that this is the case. Let me elaborate a little bit on these two notions, which I think really illustrate the importance of a labor market matching strategy. I told you a moment ago that the low skill segment of the labor market is particularly intransparent, and by this I mean that maybe relative to other segments of the labor market, the information about vacancies is mostly transmitted via word of mouth, so by informal contacts. What you have on this slide is for different European countries the proportion of jobs who are allocated on the basis of an informal channel. Informal channel can be someone you know who tells you that there is a job available in another company. This is a survey. These are survey data. So basically, survey people asked representative samples in all these countries. How did you first find out about your first job? And this is what comes out. So you can see that in all of these countries, the blue lines are the longer ones. So big proportions in Italy, for example, over 80% of low-skilled people has first heard of the job they have now through an informal contact. So this means that it's not very helpful if you're looking for a job, a low-skilled job, say in Italy, but also in other countries. You see that blue lines exceed the 50% mark in most of the countries. It's not very helpful in these countries if you're looking for a job to look in newspapers, for example, to look in the employment services databases and so on. What's more helpful is to have a good network of people who work in your profession and who can inform you of the jobs available. And of course, this is difficult. It's particularly difficult for jobless, low-skilled people who tend to be sort of isolated and cut out from social connection. This is one aspect, so lack of transparency in the low-skill segment of the labor market. And then the other aspect, which is the other obstacle, big obstacle that low-skilled people face, is stigma. And I already mentioned earlier that many of the correlates of low-skill status tend to be regarded as a negative signal by employers. Immigrant status, for example, long-term unemployed status, this kind of signals. So immigrant status is very complex. We did a study with some other European colleagues interviewing employers who employ mostly low-skilled people, and it turned out that nationality or ethnic origin can play in very different directions. In some sectors it can be an advantage to be an immigrant in some European countries. In other sectors it's clearly a disadvantage. Things are very complex. Employers tend to develop very sophisticated views of the signals that are associated with a good employee and those which are associated with a bad employee, which are based on observable characteristics like immigrant status or long-term unemployment. And what is important here for us is that these correlates of low-skilled status are also negative signals, are generally considered by negative signals by employers. And on top of that, as I was also saying earlier, even for low-skill jobs, low-skill status may act as a negative signal. So you have a low-skill job opening, and you have low-skill and medium-skill, maybe people who apply, people who have a diploma, which is not really required for the job, but the medium-skilled person is going to get preference because employers interpret the fact of having a degree, a vocational degree, for example, as evidence of a certain level, a certain maturity, a certain level of cognitive skills, and so on. And there is research by a German scholar, Elke Solga, who really shows that this is the case with German data. We can expect it to happen also in other countries. So these are the problems. What are the interventions that can help people sort of improve in this respect? There are various types of interventions available. Job search assistance, for example, coaching people when they're looking for jobs. Employment subsidies. Employment subsidies, why are they likely to be helpful in this respect? Employment subsidies can sort of allow or facilitate jobless people who experience stigma, who have many negative signals, red signals, to sort of get past this discrimination and enter into a company and show what they can do, and maybe after the subsidy expires, remain. And these tend to be the most effective measures in evaluation studies. They come out in various evaluations and also meta-evaluations as worthwhile doing. The kind of increase in employment, the level of increase in employment, you find it mentioned in the slides. There is, for example, a German program called short-term training, which maybe is a bit misleading because you get the impression that people are trained, but they're trained in job search most of the time, in most of these trainings. So it's really a way to sort of follow up job search in an intensive manner, and relative to a control group, they find employment effects in the region of 10% extra percentage points in the employment relative to a control group. France experimented, did a big pilot program a couple of years ago called Accompagnement Renforcé, and there again you find a 10% percentage point increase in the employment rate in the, relative to the control group. So this gives you an idea of the size of the effects that can be achieved by this type of policies. And it's not spectacular. It may be worthwhile doing it because, again, 10 percentage points of people who remain, maybe not indefinitely, but for a long time on benefit, can cost a lot of money to the public budget. But it's not spectacular, and this I think we need to keep in mind when it comes to sort of final evaluation of the potential of active labor market policy to deal with the problem of disadvantage experienced by low-skill people. Employment subsidies, yes, I already mentioned this. Sometimes you get more spectacular results, up to 40 percentage point increase in the employment rate, but this is because evaluation is problematic. It's very difficult to have a true control group because in many cases the employment subsidy is paid only when the jobless person has found already a job. And so you should not take the up to 40 percentage point too seriously. It's probably more a result of problematic evaluation design, rather than a result of truly effective programs. Then putting pressure was the third of the four types of interventions that I mentioned in the slide on the classification of active labor market policy. And it is difficult to assess pressure because it's something which is not measurable, but I think anyone who knows a bit how labor market services work today, it's clear that there is some pressure put on jobless people so that they search for jobs, and maybe they accept jobs that they would not have accepted in the absence of this type of pressure. And there have been attempts There is one publication by the Danish Ministry of Finance, for example, to try to look at the details of the legislation, of the regulations of labor market policy in different countries, to see to what extent pressure is applied to conditionality, for example, whether job search requirements continue when people are doing a labor market program. The OECD also has a publication on this, but it's very difficult to come up with an indicator that really measures the extent of pressure experienced by job seekers in different systems. And I think that maybe sanctions is the frequency of sanctions, the use of sanctions, even though by itself a sanction is not an intervention, a sanction follows from a behavior, but it's a good indication of the degree of pressure. A system which does not impose any sanctions, I think, would be a system where pressure is pretty low. A system which imposes many sanctions presumably is a system where pressure is pretty high, and then we don't really need to look at what kind of tools are used to put this level of pressure. And unfortunately, couldn't find the same kind of analysis for the impact of sanctions. There is research on sanctions that shows that sanctions are associated with higher rates of labor market re-entry. Research from Denmark, from the US, from Switzerland, from Germany, so it's pretty generalized. So you really have the impression that more pressure really leads people to accept jobs they would not otherwise have accepted. You really get this impression. But if you look at the kind of jobs that are taken up by people who are sanctions, there is at least one research I found made by some Swiss colleagues. You find that, as you would expect, wages are lower, and also there is a higher probability of becoming unemployed again for people who find a job after having received a sanction. So it's a kind of a mixed result. This, yes, pressure can push more people into the labor market, but not necessarily for a long period of time, and at a lower wage level relative to those who have not been sanctioned. So we may wonder whether this is to build an activation strategy around pressure, whether it is a good idea for the well-being of society as a whole. We can, I've talking about the micro level now, and the micro level, we can quickly move to the macro level and see whether all this effort that has been made in terms of active labor market policies had an impact on the employment level of low-skilled people. It's the same indicator we saw already a few times in this presentation, and you can see what really looks like a flat line here. So apparently this performance in terms of job creation that we've seen previously in the low-skill segment of the labor market seems to be completely unrelated to how much effort countries have put, at least with a crude indicator like this one, how much effort they've put in active labor market policy. Various reasons can explain this, because at the micro level we find modest effect. Maybe the effects are too modest to show up at the macro level. This is a hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that maybe there is some substitution effect going on here. There are people finding jobs thanks to the active labor market policy, but as a result of their finding a job, there is someone else who enters unemployment, so you don't see this in the employment rate. So this is the picture of the solutions and the assessment of the solutions. We have seen that the effects sometimes are there at the micro level, but they're never spectacular. We are talking about 10 to 15% in the most successful programs, and they don't show up at the macro level. And I would like now to move to the conclusion. I'm going to need maybe another 3-4 minutes if the organizers allow me to take them, so that I can properly conclude this presentation. And I think, I mean, anyone is free, of course, to interpret the story told so far as one wishes, but to me there are two conclusions that sort of follow from what I said. I think maybe we can still improve active labor market policies. There is room for improvement. This 10 to 15% effect, maybe we can push it up a little bit, maybe 20%, but maybe not 60–70%, which would really make a difference in terms of the macroeconomy. And that's why I think the second conclusion is to think of alternatives. And maybe I'm going to focus on this second aspect in the conclusion, because improving LMPs, I think it's unlikely to be very controversial. To improve government policy, anyone can agree on this. And maybe one way is to understand under what conditions training is successful and how to nurture these conditions. And then the other way is maybe to improve matching, further improve matching, be more effective in intervening in this intransparent segment of the labor market. And then thinking about alternatives is particularly difficult because, of course, we have tried everything and anything, more or less, over the 20, 30 years of big, high unemployment in Europe. And this is not a proposal. I've presented this paper elsewhere, and people ask me to elaborate my proposal. It's not a proposal. It's just a direction, let's say. Let's put it this way. And there's been a revival for a short time of Keynesian idea, the idea that the government has a role to play in creating employment to sort of restart the economy and so on. But it is true that Keynesianism, whether of the historical variety or the revived variety of 2009 in Europe and the US, has always had a strong industrial focus. So when we spoke about Keynesian kickoff interventions in Europe, it was about the car industry or it was about green jobs. And both sectors are not sectors where the low-skilled people we are talking about here are likely to find jobs. And I'm wondering if we should not think of job creation that targets low-skill services. And there are different ways one can do it. Some countries are already doing it, certainly. I mean, through in-work benefits. One way to regard in-work benefits that exist in the US, in the UK, in France, in some Nordic countries, is to see them as a subsidy to low-skill labor, which basically means that a low-skilled person does not have to finance his or her living expenses solely through work, but as an in-work benefit to supplement this. But maybe we can think of it in more conscious terms and have a more proactive way of subsidizing low-skill employment. The mechanics of job creation in this segment of the labor market may result in strong leverage for public funds. We saw earlier that it is a matter of inequality or purchasing power between the buyers and the wages of the producers of those services. If those services are subsidized, they're more affordable, then demand for services is likely to increase, and then demand for labor also is likely to increase. Maybe one could think also of job quality. If low-skilled jobs are subsidized, then the state can ask something in return to employers in terms of job quality, for example. This is a role, how can I say, brainstorming, bits of brainstorming. It's not a proposal I would like to stress, but maybe someone has ideas on how to put this forward. Then, the very last point, one fascinating thing about the traditional version of Keynesianism was that Keynes told us we help disadvantaged people, unemployed people finding jobs, but in fact it's the whole of society that benefits. And this was really made strong, the Keynesian economic policy paradigm. And I think here too, because what you can achieve with a generalized subsidization of low-skill employment is what a colleague, a German colleague, has called a low-cost environment in which competitive international industries can flourish. And to benefit from a low-cost environment at home can be a big advantage when competing with other countries, also in high-tech products. And so, again, I think this is not a proposal. It's a direction in which I think we should think perhaps, and I'd be happy to discuss with you about this. And if you want to know more, there is actually a paper available on our website. Thank you.